Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining me on this leadership and management webinar. And over the next 45 minutes or slightly under, I will be looking at really what constitutes good leadership and management in current thinking, what you really need to be thinking about in your own dental practices, and also what the regulatory requirements are. And there are two key ones I'm going to be looking at, but I'm also going to be taking a very quick look at the NHS model. And for those of you who do engage in NHS dentistry or have an NHS contract, then it's really important that you understand that this is on the radar, because this is very much something that's going to be current if you continue with an NHS contract going forward. If you have any questions as we go through, please do feel free to type them in. I will keep a close eye on the chat box, so if you have any questions, please do ask as I go, and I will hopefully give you some time to ask questions again at the end. I think one of the interesting things about leadership and management is that these days these two terms tend to be interrelated, and they tend to be interchangeable. People talk about leadership and management as if they're the same thing. But if we look back at the history of management and indeed the history of leadership, I think if we go back even just 30 years, we'll see that they were seen actually as quite different things. And I think the whole history of leadership and management is a very good example of something that's very important when it comes to looking at things like compliance, in that leadership and management ideas and concepts of what looks like good practice change in exactly the same way as what good dentistry and concepts in what constitutes good dentistry also change. It's an ever-evolving subject. So if any of you decide to revisit this webinar in 10 years' time, you might decide that some of the things that I'm saying are actually rather out of date. But there are some core concepts which I think is actually quite important for us to keep in mind and to be aware of. And I'd like to kick off really by looking at some of the key expectations that regulatory bodies and indeed a main contract manager that we have in the NHS actually have of us. Because in many ways in dental practice, people have really been left to their own devices in terms of how they run the practice. But these days there's any number of people interested in what we're doing and actually asking us to show competence and to demonstrate and give evidence that we are running the practice well, whatever that may look like. So I'd like to look first of all at the CQC. And I've picked out three of the outcomes now, and I've said now advisedly, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. Outcome 24, as I'm sure is engraved on all of your hearts by now, is a requirement relating to registered managers. And this dictates that people have their needs met because services have registered managers who are of good character, fit for their role, and have the necessary qualifications, skills, and experience. Now, I think it's important to say at the very outset that the CQC have not been prescriptive about what an appropriate or a necessary qualification is within dentistry, although they've given hints in other areas. But there is a lot of evidence, certainly from my clients, and I know talking to the people at Code, that inspectors are going in and asking not if a registered manager has a management qualification, but what management qualification they have, particularly if they have concerns over some of the areas that are being managed. And so it's something that's really much more on the radar than perhaps it was even a year ago. And here we have an absolutely explicit reference to training. People have their needs met because services are led by a competent person who undertakes the appropriate training. That, of course, may or may not be the registered manager, but anybody in a leadership role, the CQC would expect to have appropriate training in what they're doing and by inference here in leadership. And of course, outcome 26, people can be confident that the provider has the financial resources needed to provide safe and appropriate services, which more or less means that services and dental practices need to be financially managed well. And we can see further hints if we dip in and out of the current CQC outcomes that management is a critical issue for them. And The reason it's a critical issue we'll be looking at as we go through this afternoon's webinar. If we look at CQC outcomes soon, really much of this is replaced effectively by one main question, which is the service well led? Those of you who've been keeping up with developments at the CQC will know that there are going to be a number of key questions which are asked about a practice or any form of service that's governed and regulated by the CQC. And the last question on the list is the service well led? Interestingly, not is the service well managed? And it is leadership that seems to be exercising many people within healthcare and the healthcare community at the moment, partly because of some of the enormous problems that have been seen, including some of the major inquiries, where there was a lack of leadership. There wasn't necessarily a lack of management, but certainly a lack of leadership in making sure that people weren't just doing things right, but doing the right thing. And that's a distinction I'll be coming on to in just a moment. The GDC also, with its new standards for everybody working within dentistry who happens to be a registrant, has done something very interesting. In those new standards, they have actually removed a separate document which they published in 2007, which was standards for those with management responsibilities, which was actually rather a little-known document tucked away in one of the dark corners of the GDC website. That document has been withdrawn. Why? Because they have put in some explicit requirements now for people in management positions within dentistry. And here, standard 6.6, we couldn't really be clearer, could we? You must demonstrate effective management and leadership skills if you manage a team. And this is not simply for dentists or managers running practices strategically, but also for other people who have supervisory or management responsibilities further down, such as head receptionists, lead nurses, and other people who may be supervising other staff. And it's not simply enough to know these things. The GDC is quite clear here. You must demonstrate effective management and leadership skills if you manage a team. Sorry, gone backwards rather than forward. Because it goes on to clarify here, you should ensure your team has good leadership, clear shared aims, one of the hallmarks of a good team, and an understanding of their roles and responsibilities. And if you read Standard 6.6 more carefully, it will actually start to provide you with a list of things you should be doing in your practice to make sure that is actually happening, which includes everything from training through to people having a proper and effective induction. It's actually a very handy checklist in some ways. And of course, this also is looking forward to something which we were told a few years ago would be here with us now in 2014, but looks to be on the back burner for a little longer. And that, of course, is revalidation. And the last that was spoken about revalidation talked about 4 pillars of revalidation: communications, professionalism, clinical competence, and, of course, leadership and management. And it is unlikely, given the shape of the new standards, that the GDC has forgotten about this as it continues to look at leadership and management. And if we go back to this idea of demonstration, this also chimes very much with the GDC's consultation on CPD, where they are moving, as many other professional sectors have, much more towards an outcomes-based measurement of CPD rather than an inputs-based measurement of CPD. So it matters not how many hours I have misted up a mirror on exciting lectures. What actually matters and what I will be measured on is what I've actually done as a result of that learning. So it doesn't matter how many courses on leadership and management you attend or how many books you read. It's actually how you go about demonstrating good leadership and management. And this, of course, is partly the problem, because what does good leadership and management actually look like? And if it keeps changing, how on earth do we get a hold of these things? Well, the NHS has actually had a go at doing this because it has produced a relatively new healthcare leadership model. And if you go to this particular website, if you simply Google NHS healthcare leadership model, it will take you to the framework, which is quite interesting. And one of the interesting things it says is that these sorts of things and these what they call dimensions of leadership should apply to everybody working within healthcare, irrespective of their place in the hierarchy, their role, or seniority. Because what's coming across loud and clear is that we cannot have issues and problems and cases such as Mid Staffordshire ever again, because people need to take responsibility and need to take their professionalism seriously. And the NHS healthcare leadership model provides these 9 dimensions, which are really more about behaviour rather than activities. And that's perhaps one of the big differences between leadership and management, if we do want to tease these things out. We could argue that management is about a series of things that we should be doing, and leadership is very much perhaps about the way we should be doing these things. And as we'll see very briefly a little later on in this webinar, thinking about the way we should be doing some of these things has changed quite dramatically over the last 40 to 50 years, when people really started to think about leadership in business and organisations quite seriously. So here are these 9 dimensions. Inspiring shared purpose. That seems to make a great deal of sense and really chimes with the GDC's idea that leaders in dental practice really ought to be managing a team with clear shared aims. Leading with care towards the people within the team. Evaluating information, perhaps that is an activity rather than the way that we do things, but perhaps, being thoughtful about the information that we have. Connecting our service, again, that goes very much towards the GDC's new standards around team working and working in collaboration in the best interests of the patient. Sharing the vision, very similar to inspiring shared purpose, but if you go into these things in a little more detail, which you can, by simply looking at some of the questions that are asked under each particular dimension, then you'll see that there's something slightly different, as is engaging the team. And then perhaps some of the more difficult things, and this I think is a very interesting thing, which is holding to account. It is having, if you like, the guts to challenge people who are not performing in the way that we would wish them to, who aren't pulling their weight or being a good team member or treating patients in perhaps the way that we would like to. So that's, I think, a very important question for us to ask, because perhaps sometimes we don't feel that we want to do that, particularly if this is with somebody who is one of our peers, or perhaps might be our associate, or we feel more uncomfortable about dealing with some of these difficult questions. Good leadership in this model is also about developing capability, training people and developing our teams, not just to do the jobs we need them to do now, but the jobs that we are going to need them to do in the future as well. And using influencing skills to gain results. And that's a very good point that's coming up. This idea about results and what results should look like within a dental practice. Now, many of these things are very behavioural driven, or about behaviour rather than things to do. But over the course of the next few minutes, what I'm hoping to do is to tease out some of the things which, if we're going to consider ourselves good managers and good leaders, we should be doing in our practices. And you can hopefully use this as a checklist for yourselves to evaluate and just reflect on how well you're doing some of these things, and if there are any areas that perhaps you need to develop in terms of your skills and your capabilities and your abilities.